In the vast silence of forgotten history, one truth has been buried deeper than any ancient tomb. Imagine it with me. The golden sunlight spilling across the Ethiopian highlands, where kingdoms rose older than the marble pillars of Rome. Queens with skin like polished obsidian, their crowns gleaming with gold forged in fires hotter than the desert sun. Prophets who spoke in tongues older than Latin, their voices echoing through valleys carved by the Nile's ancient fury. These were the faces of the Bible, kissed by the relentless African sun, born from the rich red soil of Kush, Mizraim and Put. But those faces, they were quietly replaced. Erased from the stained glass windows of cathedrals, from the illustrated pages of children's Bibles clutched in Sunday school hands, from the sweeping Hollywood epics that paint salvation in shades of ivory and gold. You've seen it, haven't you? A Jesus with eyes like a Nordic sky, blue and piercing. A Moses emerging from the reeds with skin as pale as the parting waves. An Egypt that looks more like a Renaissance fair than the cradle of black genius. But the scriptures whisper otherwise, if you dare to listen closely. The Psalms sing of the tents of Ham, those sprawling encampments under starlit African skies. Genesis traces the bloodlines of nations back to Kush, the land we call Ethiopia today, where the earth itself seems to pulse with the rhythm of forgotten drums. And in the book of Zephaniah, a thunderous promise rings out. From beyond the rivers of Kush, God's worshippers would rise, their offerings carried on winds scented with myrrh and frankincense. These are not whitewashed parables, my friends. These are black legacies etched in the very clay tablets and scrolls that birthed the book we hold sacred. And they've been erased, not by accident, but by design, a deliberate stroke of the colonial brush across the canvas of truth. Today, in this journey we're embarking on together, we begin to reverse that eraser, because the truth lives in the very pages of the Bible, but only if you know where to look, beyond the margins, into the heart of the text itself. And in this deep dive, we'll expose the lie that has enslaved generations, the so-called curse of Ham. What it really says will shake the foundations of everything you've been taught. So don't blink, don't scroll away. Don't let them rewrite your inheritance any longer. Instead, join me now. Type in the comments, I reclaim my roots, because truth isn't dangerous unless it's hidden, and today we're unearthing it all. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Not the sanitized version from your childhood storybook, but the raw, unfiltered genealogy that the Bible lays out like a map of the human soul. Picture the world after the flood. Waters receding from a battered earth, the air thick with the scent of wet soil and promise. Noah, the ark's weary captain, steps onto dry ground, his 3 sons trailing behind, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These aren't just names in a family tree. They're the roots of every nation, every culture, every face that has ever gazed at the stars. Shem, the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, the Arabs with their flowing robes and desert poetry, the Jews whose psalms still echo in synagogues from Jerusalem to New York, the Syrians whose ancient alphabets birthed our modern scripts, Japheth, the father of the Indo-Europeans, his blood flowing through the veins of Greeks who philosophized under olive trees, Romans who built aqueducts that spanned empires, and later the Asians whose silk roads connected continents in threads of gold and spice. And then there's Ham. Ah, Ham, the name that sends shivers through Sunday school memories, twisted into a shadow by preachers with agendas sharper than any sword. But what if I told you that Ham isn't just a man in a cautionary tale? He's a message, a declaration, carved into the Hebrew tongue itself. In the original language, Ham means burnt, black, or hot. Not some vague metaphor for a summer day, but a direct nod to skin tone, to the fierce climate of equatorial lands, to an identity forged in the crucible of the sun. It's no coincidence. This is the Bible naming blackness at the dawn of post-flood humanity, placing it not as an afterthought, but as a cornerstone. And yet how often have we sat through sermons where Ham's name is skimmed over like a footnote in a dusty ledger? He wasn't a footnote. He was the father of nations, the progenitor of civilizations that would outshine the stars. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations as it's called, a sprawling family tree that scholars have pored over for millennia, debating its every branch like cartographers charting unclaimed seas. Here, after the deluge, Noah's sons fan out across the globe. Ham's lineage explodes into life. His 4 sons, Kush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, become the architects of Africa's golden age. Kush, the firstborn, whose name thunders through scripture more than 50 times, synonymous with the highlands of Ethiopia and the sun-baked plateaus of Nubia. Mizraim, the builder of pyramids that scrape the heavens, the land of the Nile where pharaohs dreamed in hieroglyphs. Put, whose people roamed the coastal dunes of Libya, their sails catching winds that carried tales of Berber warriors and Phoenician traders. And Canaan, the youngest, whose fate would be tangled in prophecies of land and servitude, but whose descendants would till the soils of what we now call Palestine. This isn't poetry, it's geography etched in divine ink. Psalm 78:51 doesn't mince words. It speaks of Egypt as the tents of Ham, those nomadic pavilions of black goat hides stretched taut against the desert night, filled with the smoke of cooking fires and the chants of storytellers. Genesis 10 doesn't just mention Ham. It builds the map of Africa from his loins, tracing rivers and borders that still define the continent today. Even in modern Arabic, Egypt whispers Mizr, a direct echo of Mizraim, Ham's second son, a linguistic bridge spanning 4,000 years, unbroken by time or tide. Now, pause with me here. Let that sink in like rain into parched earth. Why do you think these verses are never taught with the fire they deserve? Why is the African origin of these nations so often downplayed, dismissed, or distorted in the halls of academia and the pews of churches? Because, my friends, if Ham is the father of Africa, if the Bible names blackness as foundational, not accidental, it upends everything. It challenges centuries of colonial theology, those dusty tomes penned by men in powdered wigs who saw the world through lenses of superiority. It exposes the lie that blackness was ever cursed, ever secondary. In fact, the lineage of Ham reveals that Africa wasn't left out of God's grand design. Africa was the starting point, the anvil upon which the hammer of creation struck first and hardest. And if Ham was the father, his sons were kings, unyielding, brilliant, eternal. Consider Kush, that firstborn son, whose story will unravel next. But before we dive deeper, let's linger on the economic pulse of these Hamitic lands. Trade routes snaked from the Ethiopian highlands like veins of gold, carrying ivory tusks carved with scenes of lion hunts, ebony wood polished to mirror the night sky, and spices that perfumed the air from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Politically, these weren't fractious tribes. They were confederacies of power, with kings whose scepters were forged from meteorite iron, advisors schooled in the stars' secret languages. Technologically, they harnessed the Nile's floodwaters with irrigation canals that fed fields of emmer wheat and durra sorghum, their forges belching smoke as they smelted. Copper into tools sharper than obsidian blades. Culturally, it was a renaissance before the word existed. Oral epics recited under baobab trees, whose branches clawed at the moon like the fingers of ancestors reaching back. And the global impact? Oh, it ripples still. The wealth of Kush funded armies that checked the rise of Persia. The wisdom of Mizraim's scribes influenced the law codes of Hammurabi in Babylon. Without Ham's sons, the classical world as we know it crumbles. The Greeks borrowed geometry from Egyptian blackboards. The Romans aped the administrative genius of Nubian clerks. Yet, in every children's Bible, with its pastel illustrations of fair-haired patriarchs and every Hollywood epic where extras in linen kilts sport suspiciously light complexions, these men are airbrushed into European models. Why? Because restoration demands reckoning. When we trace the Bible's first map of humanity, we find black lineage not on the margins, relegated to side panels, but in the center of God's unfolding plan, illuminated like the gold leaf in an illuminated manuscript. Here's a thought to carry with you as we press on. If Ham, the so-called burnt one, stood beside the ark when the waters finally receded, his dark skin glistening with the spray of a new world, if he lived to see 6 generations of descendants according to the Book of Jubilees, that ancient text we'll explore later, then what else did he leave behind? What stories were never scratched onto papyrus but passed through the rhythmic pulse of djembe drums and the haunting melodies of chorus strings in the lands of Kush and Misraim? And what happens when we finally start to remember, when the veil lifts and the full spectrum of Scripture's colors blazes forth? Hold that question close. In the next chapter of our journey, we'll meet Kush himself, not as a distant name, but as the blueprint for black kingdoms that long predated the empires we were taught to revere. What if the greatest African empires weren't lost to the sands of time, but deliberately erased from the collective memory, their stones toppled not by invaders, but by ink and ideology? Before the legions of Rome marched in lockstep across Gaul, before the philosophers of Greece debated in agoras ringed by marble, before even the ziggurats of Babylon clawed at the clouds, there was Kush. Not a fleeting myth, not a scattered tribe huddled in mud huts, but a kingdom, a vast, unyielding lineage that pulsed with the heartbeat of the Nile. In Genesis 10:7, Kush bursts onto the scene as the firstborn of Ham, the father of black civilization, his name a clarion call that echoes through more than 50 mentions. In the Bible, each one heavier with prophecy than the last. Kush wasn't just a man, he was a movement, a geopolitical thunderclap. When the prophets of Israel lifted their voices in lament or triumph, they spoke of God's people beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, and that Ethiopia was Kush, the land where the Atbara and Blue Nile converged in a frothy embrace, watering fields that yielded crops enough to feed armies and scholars alike. The name Kush in the original Hebrew was later rendered as Ethiopia, not by scribal error, but because in the ancient mind they were one and the same, the interchangeable breath of a civilization that spanned from the fourth cataract to the first, a realm of black granite cliffs and fertile floodplains that mocked the barrenness of lesser lands. Zephaniah 3:10 doesn't whisper, it roars, "From beyond the rivers of Kush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones shall bring mine offering." That's no poetic flourish, that's raw geography, pointing to the Nile's serpentine path through Sudan and Ethiopia, the cradle of biblical black royalty. And let's pause here. Let the weight of that settle. If Kush was the father of Ethiopia, if from his loins sprang the kingdom of Aksum, one of the first empires on earth to embrace Christianity in the 4th century under King Izana, who minted coins emblazoned with the cross centuries before Europe's conversion, then why do most Western sermons reduce Africa to a mission field, a blank slate awaiting the gospel from pale hands? Why is Kush taught as a background hum, a vague synonym rather than the foundational kingdom whose ruins still defy the erosion of millennia? The truth, unearthed by archaeologists like Timothy Kendall in the sweltering digs of Meroe, is staggering. The empire of Kush predates most European dynasties by 1,000 years, its capital at Napata rising around 1000 BCE, a metropolis of red brick palaces and towering temples where priests in leopard skins invoked Amun, the ram-headed god whose horns curled like the Nile's bends. Economically, Kush was a juggernaut. Gold mines in the eastern deserts yielded nuggets the size of fists, traded along the incense route to Arabia and beyond, funding a merchant class whose caravans groaned under loads of frankincense, myrrh, and ostrich feathers. Politically, it was a matrilineal powerhouse. Queens known as Candaces ruled with iron fists wrapped in silk. Their divine authority passed through mother's blood, challenging the patriarchal rigidities of Mesopotamia technologically. These were innovators. They domesticated the horse for chariots that thundered across the savannah, their iron smelters at Meroe, producing blades that outcut Egyptian bronze by the 8th century BCE, a blast furnace revolution that rippled into sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. Culturally, Kush was a tapestry of genius. Hieroglyphic scripts evolved into the Meroitic alphabet, undeciphered to this day, but whispering secrets of astronomy, where priests tracked Sirius's heliacal rising to predict the floods with uncanny precision. And the arts? Oh, the arts were alive, breathing. Colossal statues of kings with full lips and coiled hair, their eyes inlaid with lapis lazuli that captured the depth of eternal nights. But the global impact of Kush? It reshaped the world in shadows we still feel. The Queen of Sheba, that enigmatic figure of 1 Kings 10, riding into Solomon's court with camels laden with 120 talents of gold, scholars like Edward Ullendorf argue her throne was in Aksum, Kush's heir, her wisdom a Kushite export that fertilized Israelite theology. And then there's Taharka, the Kushite pharaoh whose name thunders in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37. Around 701 BCE, as the Assyrian juggernaut under Sennacherib barreled toward Jerusalem, its armies leaving pyramids of skulls in their wake, Taharka, grandson of Kushite kings, his skin dark as the basalt quarries of Jebel Barkal, marched north with 20,000 warriors. He wasn't there to conquer, he was there to protect. The Bible doesn't shy from it. And Taharka, king of Kush, came out to fight against them, staving off the siege in a miracle of divine wind and Ethiopian steel. A black African king, descendant of Ham, shielding the city of David from oblivion. Yet you won't find Taharka's likeness in stained glass, his victories recited in Sunday homilies. Why? Because his dark skin, his unapologetic Africanness, disrupts the narrative they sought to preserve, a tale where saviors are fair and the saved are northern. History doesn't deny him. The sands of Tanis yield his stele, inscribed with victories over the Assyrians, his piety to Yahweh mingling with Amun's rites in a syncretic faith that bridged worlds. But our education? It selectively forgets, airbrushing him into footnotes while lionizing Alexander's tutors. Think on that. While Europe huddled in Iron Age tribes, forging petty kingdoms from bog iron and blood feuds, Kush had a written language that preserved epics longer than the Iliad, royalty that traced back to divine queens, astronomy that mapped constellations we still name after Greek myths they predated. And the lesser-known controversies? Dive into the historiography, and you'll find flames. In the 19th century, European explorers like James Bruce dismissed Kushite pyramids, over 200 in Sudan, steeper and more numerous than Giza's, as primitive, their black builders unfit for such grandeur. But radiocarbon dating in the 1970s by teams from the University of Khartoum proved otherwise. These were engineered marvels from 800 BCE, their superstructures aligned to solstices with precision rivaling Stonehenge. Compare that to contemporaneous Britain, still painting itself blue with woad, and the erasure stings sharper. Or consider the side tangent of the Blemmies, Kush's nomadic allies, headless warriors in Herodotus's tales. Their faces in their chests, a Greek slur for the fierce Meroitic archers who harried Roman legions under Augustus. Taharka's biography alone could fill volumes. Born around 690 BCE in Napata, he ascended as the fifth king of the 25th dynasty. His reign ablaze from 690 to 664 BCE. A warrior poet, he composed hymns to Amun that scholars like Laszlo Torok translate as pleas for cosmic harmony. His armies blending Kushite cavalry with Egyptian chariots in Nile, battles that echoed to the gates of Thebes. Defeated by Esarhaddon in 671 BCE, he fled south, rebuilding Meroe into an iron empire that outlasted the Ptolemies. His legacy? A son-in-law empire that influenced Ptolemaic coinage, and a bloodline that, through Aksum, touched the courts of Byzantium. So the next time someone questions Africa's place in biblical history, remind them, Kush came first, not as a slave bartered in chains, not as a servant, bowing low, but as a sovereign, his throne a mountain of black granite. And perhaps that's why the silence around him has been so intentional, a veil drawn by councils and curricula to dim the light of origins too bright for fragile egos. But the ruins still stand. The bent pyramids of Nuri, the echoing hypostyle halls of Naka, testimonies that refuse to be silenced. In our next chapter, we'll cross the Nile to the heart of Mizraim, Ham's second son, and peel back the layers of ancient Egypt's truth. The paintings on those tomb walls tell one story, vivid and unyielding, but the history books, they've spun another yarn entirely. Which version will you choose to believe? Why do the pharaohs in your textbooks stare out with features more akin to Renaissance angels than the sons of the Nile? Narrow noses, porcelain skin, eyes like frozen lakes, when their own tombs, those eternal houses of eternity, proclaim a different gospel. Picture it vividly. A hot sirocco wind sweeping through the Valley of the Kings, stirring the dust of 3 millennia. Sandstone walls alive with murals, painted in the ochre days of the New Kingdom, depict warriors with broad noses and full lips, their dark skin gleaming like burnished ebony under the torchlight. Queens with intricate braids, woven with lapis beads, their gold jewelry shimmering like the river at dawn, broad hips swaying in linen sheaths that whisper of fertility rites older than the pyramids. But somewhere along the line, perhaps in the flickering lamplight of Victorian drawing rooms or the smoke-filled salons of colonial cartographers, these features were softened. Skin tones lightened with the stroke of a revisionist's brush. And Egypt, that cradle of African greatness, the forge where humanity hammered out its first philosophies, was slowly, insidiously painted white. A divorce from its roots, engineered not by gods, but by men with maps and motives. Let's journey back to the source, to the unyielding text of Genesis 10:6, where Mizraim in the tongues of old, emerges as the son of Ham, the founder of Egypt, his name a seed that blossoms into the Arabic Mizr we utter today. This is no flights of fancy, it's linguistic continuity, a thread pulled taut from biblical Hebrew to the call to prayer echoing from Cairo's minarets. So if Ham is the father of black nations, his burnt essence infusing the blood of continents and Mitzrayim his direct heir, why has ancient Egypt been so ruthlessly severed from its African moorings? The Bible never once dubs Egypt a European outpost, a way station for fair-skinned wanderers. No, Psalm 105:23 thunders it clear. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. Egypt equals the land of Ham equals the land of blackness, an equation as straightforward as the Nile's northbound flow. This isn't fringe scholarship. It's the spine of the text itself, and to bolster it, let's call on Herodotus, the Greek father of history, who in the 5th century BCE donned his traveller's cloak and trekked to the delta. In his Histories Book 2, he writes without hesitation, "The Egyptians are black-skinned with woolly hair." Let that reverberate. Over 2,000 years ago, a white Hellene from Halicarnassus stood amid the pylons of Karnak and saw what was obvious to the eye. A people of African descent, their curls tight as the spirals of DNA, their complexions a spectrum from mahogany to midnight. It wasn't controversial then. It was fact, etched in the art that adorns every temple frieze. The broad-shouldered soldiers of Tutankhamun's army, depicted in the tomb of Hui, with negroid features that modern craniofacial analysis confirms as sub-Saharan. The DNA from royal mummies, extracted in labs from Cairo to Chicago, studies by Zahi Hawass in 2010, revealing haplogroups E1b1a and L2, markers dominant in East and West Africa, proves it beyond doubt. Yet in Western cinema, Egypt becomes a European cosplay. Charlton Heston as Moses, his beard a cascade of auburn waves. Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, her coal-lined eyes framed by improbably pale skin. But Cleopatra was the outlier, a Ptolemaic import of Macedonian blood, ruling over a populace that looked more like the Nubians at her gates than the Olympians in her lineage. Now here's where the narrative twists like the river itself. The kingdom of Kush, that black African powerhouse we just left, didn't just border Egypt, it swallowed it whole. In the 8th century BCE, under P, the first pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, Kushite armies surged north, not as barbarians at the gates, but as kin reclaiming family soil. Pi's stela, towering in Gebel Barkal's temple, recounts his 744 BCE campaign, a ritual conquest where he spared Thebes after its submission, his piety a blend of Amun's thunder and Ma'at's balance. This was the Kushite dynasty, black pharaohs from 760 to 656 BCE, rulers like Shabaka, who restored the temples of Luxor with Nubian granite, and Shebitku, whose alliances with Tyre and Sidon wove Egypt into Phoenician trade webs that spanned the Mediterranean. And Taharqa again, yes, our defender of Jerusalem, reigns supreme here too, his 690-664 BCE rule a pinnacle of revival. Mentioned in Isaiah 37:9 as Tirhaka, king of Kush, he wasn't just a biblical cameo, he was a colossus. His kiosk at Naka, half buried in sand, depicts him smiting enemies with a mace, his physique a study in Kushite vigor, muscular, regal, unapologetically dark. He defended Judah from Sennacherib in 701 BCE, his forces clashing in the delta, buying time for Hezekiah's prayers to summon that angel of death upon the Assyrians. But his Egyptian legacy: he built the greatest temple at Kawa, its walls inscribed with solar hymns that prefigure Akhenaten's monotheism by a century, his engineers raising obelisks that dwarfed later Roman needles. The causes of this dynasty's rise: economic disparity, Egypt's third intermediate period, a chaos of Libyan princelings squabbling over scraps, met Kush's unified might, fueled by Meroe's iron boom. Effects: a cultural renaissance. Black artists infused Egyptian canon with Nubian motifs, coiled hair on sphinxes, broader hips on goddesses. Yet controversies abound. In the 18th century, Count Constantin de Volney sneered that Egypt's blackness proved its inferiority, a racist screed echoed in Flinders Petrie's excavations, which prioritized Aryan influences until Cheikh Anta Diop's 1950s linguistic analyses, linking Wolof words to ancient Egyptian, flipped the script. Diop, the Senegalese polymath, argued in Nations Nègres et Culture, using carbon-14 and serology, that Egypt was 90% African, a thesis vindicated by 21st century genomics. Sub-stories pull us deeper. Consider Queen Amanirenas, Taharqa's spiritual heir, who in 30 BCE faced Augustus's legions. Blinded in one eye by Roman javelins, she sued for peace on equal terms. Her archers poison arrows etching fear into Caesar's dispatches, a black woman who humbled an empire. Or the economic web. Mizraim's granaries, built under Sesostris III around 1870 BCE, stored surplus that fed Hamitic trade, bartering linen for Kushite gold, influencing Minoan frescoes on Thera. Technologically, they pioneered the Shaduf irrigation lever, boosting yields tenfold, a legacy in modern Aswan. Politically, the pharaoh's divine kingship, Horus incarnate, mirrored Ham's patriarchal fire, with viziers like Imhotep, deified architect of the Step Pyramid in 2650 BCE, whose black features in Saqqara reliefs mock Eurocentric denials. Global impact? Egypt's black heart pumped knowledge to the world. Thales of Miletus studied Nilotic geometry in 600 BCE, birthing Greek math. Hippocrates dissected mummified cadavers smuggled from Thebes. The regional legacy? The 25th dynasty's fall to Esarhaddon in 671 BCE scattered Kushite elites, seeding Garamantes in Libya and Aksum's rise. But the erasure? It protected a narrative where innovation is northern, genius pale, a historiography from Manetho's king lists, corrupted by Arab chroniclers, to Hollywood's The Mummy, where Anubis masks hide African roots. This matters profoundly. If Egypt was black and Israel gestated within its borders, Joseph's rise under Hyksos around 1650 BCE, Moses' flight from Ramesses II in 1270 BCE, then the biblical narrative wasn't forged in Levantine isolation. It was shaped in African soil, tempered by the heat of Ham's descendants. And perhaps that's why so many clamor to rewrite it, to bleach the delta's mud from Scripture's hem. In our next chapter, we'll confront the serpent in this garden, the so-called curse of Ham. One verse, twisted like a hangman's noose, justified the bondage of millions. But what does the Bible truly say? What if the curse wasn't on Ham at all? What if Christianity's greatest crime wasn't mere violence, but a mistranslation that scarred souls for eternity? One verse. One fleeting moment in the shadow of the ark. One ancient pronouncement, warped over centuries into a doctrine that chained continents in iron and ideology. Let's transport ourselves there, to the vine-draped hills just after the flood, around 2500 BCE by young Earth reckonings. Though archaeology whispers of Mesopotamian deluges near 2900 BCE. Noah, the righteous one who communed with the divine amid storm-tossed waves, plants a vineyard, rows of vine stock twisting like the roots of the world tree. The grapes swell under a tentative sun, their juice fermented into wine that warms the blood and loosens the tongue. Noah drinks deeply, lies uncovered in his tent, vulnerable as the reborn earth itself. Enter Ham, the father of Canaan, who stumbles upon this scene, his father's nakedness exposed, a breach of ancient honor codes that demanded filial piety as sacred as sacrifice. Ham doesn't avert his eyes. He tells his brothers outside, perhaps in shock, perhaps in jest, perhaps in the casual irreverence of a son too bold for decorum. Shem and Japheth, ever dutiful, take a garment, envision it, heavy wool woven on a post-flood loom, drape it across their shoulders, and walk backward into the tent, faces turned away, preserving the veil of dignity. Noah awakens, his wrath a tempest reborn. But mark this carefully, he doesn't curse Ham. No, the patriarch's voice, thick with vinous fury, falls on Canaan, Ham's fourth son, the youngest, the wayward one. Cursed be Canaan, Genesis 9:25 intones, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. That's it, just one verse, stark as a desert oracle. Yet somehow in the alchemy of prejudice, that line transmuted into a theology, damning all of Black Africa. Not Canaan alone, not Ham's line in specificity, but every descendant, every shade of ebony skin, every soul bartered on auction blocks from Gory Island to Virginia's tobacco fields. How did we arrive at this abyss? Follow the trail through history's darker corridors. The Atlantic slave trade, that monstrous engine from 1501 to 1867, shipped 12.5 million Africans across the Middle Passage, their cries swallowed by the Atlantic's roar. European theologians, men like Cotton Mather in Puritan Boston or Dutch Reformed divines in Cape Town, scoured scripture for sanction. They seized on Ham's blackness, conflating his name's etymology with a divine mandate. Ham sinned, his curse eternal, his progeny predestined for servitude. It was the curse of Ham doctrine, repackaged in sermons from Lisbon to London, justifying the lash as God's ledger. But let's be crystalline. This is not the Bible's word. This is not the Hebrew text's intent, passed by rabbis in the Talmud who saw only familial discord, not racial doom. It was weaponized scripture, a holy lie birthed in the belly of empire, its consequences unholy beyond measure. Dr. Cain Hope Felder, the towering editor of the African Heritage Study Bible, lays it bare in his 1993 work. The curse was on Canaan, not Ham, and certainly not on Africa. Felder, a Howard University scholar whose voice thundered against Eurocentric exegesis, traces the distortion to the 16th century, when Portuguese friars like Bartolomé de las Casas debated indigenous souls, but spared Africans the same mercy, citing Ham as eternal bondman. Even ancient Jewish commentators, like Rashi in his 11th century glosses, never extended the curse to skin. It was about Canaan's later sins, settling Shem's allotted land, per the Book of Jubilees, defying Noah's partition of the earth among brothers. Jubilees, that 2nd century BCE retelling revered by Essenes at Qumran, expands. Ham's sires Kush, Mizraim, Phut and Canaan, but the youngest rebels, claiming the Fertile Crescent meant for Shem, his avarice, the true curse's seed. It was about covenant boundaries, land ethics echoing Leviticus's Jubilee laws, not racial hierarchies etched in melanin. Yet in slave traders' hands, from John Hawkins's 1562 voyages to Jefferson's pen in 1787, this verse became the theological bullet, loaded and fired to chain generations. The residue lingers like smoke from a long-extinguished pyre. In classrooms where African history dawns with 1619's chains, not the sovereignty of Meroe. In pulpits where Ham is invoked only in shame, a cautionary shade, not the sire of kings. In systems that frame blackness as hurdle, not heritage. Consider the economic ripple. The curse fueled plantations from Brazil's Engenhos to Mississippi's levees, amassing wealth that bankrolled the Industrial Revolution, 20 million in Liverpool slave profits by 1800, per Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. Politically, it buttressed apartheid's Verwoerdian lies, the 1948 National Party citing Ham to segregate townships. Culturally, it scarred psyches, from Phyllis Wheatley's 1773 elegies, pleading against the curse, to Malcolm X's 1964 pilgrimage, shattering it in Mecca's mosaic. But causes, the doctrine's roots burrow to Augustine's city of God, misreading Ham as libidinous, a seed of medieval blood libels. Effects, transatlantic trauma, but also resistance, Ethiopianism in 19th century churches, where bishops like Henry McNeill Turner preached Ham's redemption. Controversies flare. In 1978, Mormon doctrine lifted its Hamite priesthood ban after decades of outcry, admitting the curse's fabrication. Side tangents abound. The biography of Robert Hamlin, a 17th century engraver whose Curse of Ham illustrations depicted Africans as ape-like, influencing Darwin's detractors. Or the 1830 American Colonization Society, shipping cursed freedmen to Liberia, only for it to become Africa's first republic in 1847, an ironic triumph. Historiography shifts with scholars like David Goldenberg, whose Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, 2003, dissects rabbinic silences, proving no pre-Christian racial gloss. Modern interpretations, Afrocentric voices like Molafi Kete Asante reclaim Ham as hero, his hot name evoking creative fire, not damnation. So now, we ask, if one misread verse could enslave empires, what blooms when we read aright? If we reclaim Ham's saga not as shackle, but symphony, a lineage of Kushite defenders, Egyptian astronomers, Libyan navigators, then truth, once exhumed, defies reburial. Generations stir, roots reclaim soil. But what of the texts that preserved Africa's unvarnished tale? Why were they banished from the Bibles we cherish? What happened to the scriptures that dared tell Africa's side? The volumes where Ham strides not as villain, but vanguard. And who decreed they didn't belong in the sacred library, their pages branded apocryphal by councils convened in chilly European halls. What if the oldest city after the flood wasn't the mud-brick ziggurats of Ur in Mesopotamia, but a thriving metropolis in Africa's heart, its founder, a black patriarch honoring his queen, the Bible you cradled as a child, the King James with its gilded edges, skips this chapter, omitting the where and who of that first post-deluge rebuild. It names no streets, carves no cornerstone, but the Book of Jubilees does, that ancient retelling from the 2nd century BCE, revered by early Christians, preserved intact only in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, where Ge'ez scribes guarded it like a flame against the dark. Jubilees paints a vivid tableau. Ham, the burnt one, father of Africa's dawn, steps first onto the cleansed earth, his feet sinking into loess soil still damp with receding waves. He doesn't wander aimlessly. He builds. He founds the first city of the New Age, naming it Malch in honor of his beloved wife. Yes, Malch, the queen whose name means queenly in Semitic roots, a black woman immortalized in brick and mortar. Imagine the scene. Laborers from Ham's fledgling clan hauling sun-baked adobe under a sky vast as promise. Children chasing fledgling ibises through half-raised walls, the air alive with the clink of copper tools and the chants of foundation hymns. This was no rude outpost. It was a memory-made stone, a foundation stone for civilizations that would eclipse the stars. But why, then, isn't Malch in the Western canon? Why was Jubilees stripped from Protestant Bibles at the 16th century Reformation? Labelled pseudepigrapha by Jerome's Latin Vulgate filters, yet exalted in Ethiopia's Lalibela churches, carved from living rock in the 12th century by King Lalibela's visions. Because Malch was more than a city, it was a symbol, an African genesis that needed no Mediterranean validation, a testament to black womanhood as co-creator in the divine reset. And staggering still, Ham, per Jubilees 1018, endures over 600 years, a Methuselah of the south, witnessing 6 generations unfold. He sires Kush's Nubian heights, Mizraim's delta dominions, Put's Saharan caravans, Canaan's Levantine vines, empires rising like the morning over Kilimanjaro. Where was he buried, this titan? Whispers from Ethiopian chronicles like the Kebra Nagast point to Sudan, where Kush's pyramids at El Kuru cradle royal dust, red sands shifting over tombs, aligned to the equinox. Others claim Ethiopia's highlands near Gondar's castle cluster, where Fasilides' 17th century walls echo ancient circuits, sacred scrolls in Debre Libanos monastery, attesting Ham's rest amid incense groves. A few voices, fringe but fervent, murmur Egypt, beneath the Sphinx's pause, where seismic scans hint at chambers untouched since Ptolemaic times. Certainty eludes, but the legacy? It courses deeper than Nile silt. These texts, Jubilees, Enoch with its fallen watchers and astral secrets, Maccabees' heroic stands, were excluded at councils like Nicaea in 325 CE, where Athanasius's canon pruned dangerous volumes that elevated African agency. The Ethiopian Bible, with 81 books to the Protestant 66, retains them as sacred. Its scribes in the 15th century Gaia's Renaissance copying vellum folios under beeswax candles, preserving Enoch's cosmogony where Ham teaches post-flood astronomy. Why the ban? Because in those pages, Africa doesn't cameo, it protagonists. It forges cities like Malch around 2300 BCE, predating Eridu's Sumerian claims. It leads with Ham's migration south, populating the Sahel with Bantu speakers, whose Iron Age dawned independently by 500 BCE. Culturally, Jubilees weaves ethics, Sabbath as cosmic rhythm, echoing Egyptian Sed festivals every 30 years. Economically, it details Ham's allotments, fertile Ethiopia for Kush, trade-rich coasts for Put. Politically, Noah's division prefigures Berlin Conference partitions, but with equity. Technologically, Enoch's angels teach metallurgy, mirrored in Meroa's blooms. Global impact? These texts influenced Qumran's Dead Sea Scrolls, seeding Essene asceticism that touched early Christianity. Their exclusion starved Western theology of African depth, birthing a Euro-Jesus. Historiography's tangents, James Bruce's 1770 Red Sea travels discovered Jubilees manuscripts dismissed as fable until R. H. Charles's 1913 edition validated its antiquity. Controversies rage. Fundamentalists decry it as non-inspired, yet Coptic fragments confirm its 1st century BCE origins. Substories, the biography of Abba Salama, 4th century Ethiopian translator who rendered Jubilees amid hyena howls, his work fueling the 333 AD conversion under Frumentius. Or Enoch's side, its Book of Watchers details Ham's giant offspring, paralleling Greek titans, a cross-cultural echo. Modern takes? James Washington's Jubilees and the African Experience 2015 argues its preservation in Africa resisted colonial erasure, a quiet rebellion. So the real query lingers. What else was excised? What prophecies of black messiahs, miracles in Aksum's tabots, were shelved to silence the South and exalt the North? In our final chapter, we return to Genesis itself, Eden, that verdant archetype, and pose the question that quakes foundations. Was paradise African? Were the first human steps etched in black soil under an equatorial sun? For centuries we've been schooled to gaze northward, to Rome's forums humming with togaed orators, Jerusalem's golden dome shimmering in Judean light, Athens' Acropolis perched like a philosopher's crown for the sacred sparks of history. But what if we've peered in the wrong direction, our compasses skewed by cartographers with agendas? What if the Garden of Eden, that mythic nexus where God walked with dust-forged man, wasn't a temperate Mesopotamian idyll, but an African Eden, its rivers coiling through the continent's fiery heart? Genesis 2:13 doesn't hedge. The name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Kush. Kush, Kush, that Ethiopian expanse, the same son of Ham whose legacy we've traced. Not allegory, but atlas. The Gihon winds through Africa's eastern rift, the Blue Niles. Precursor, watering lands where acacia thorns guard secrets older than sin. Modern science, that unlikely ally, corroborates what scripture hinted millennia ago. Paleontologists like Tim White, sifting Omo Kibish in Ethiopia's Turkana Basin, unearthed Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, 3.2 million years old, but more crucially, Homo sapiens cradle around 200,000 BCE in the same soils. Her bones, unearthed in 1974, with pelvises wide for bipedal treks, across savannah proclaim humanity's dawn was African, not some Caucasian cave. Mitochondrial Eve, traced by Rebecca Cahn's 1987 study to 150,000 years past in East Africa, binds us all to that cradle, black soil birthing every hue. So if Eden's rivers bathed Kush, and our ancestors' femurs lie in Hadar Badlands, if the first civilizations sprouted from Ham's loins, why the northern mythos? Why salvation history framed as white? Northern, foreign, Byzantine icons with almond-eyed Christs, Renaissance Madonnas with Flemish curls, when the first breath, the primal worship, the inaugural stroll with the eternal may have transpired beneath an African vault, cicadas chorusing Eden's hymns. Psalm 68:31, prophecies not plea but power. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God, hands outstretched in devotion, as leaders, not beggars, but you bearers of the flame. And Revelation seals it. John's apocalyptic vision in chapter 7 beholds a multitude of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, their robes washed in lamb's blood. And among those voices, Africa's resounds, from Gondwanan chants to Harlem gospels. Ethiopia embodies this, the oldest continuous Christian realm, converted en masse in 330 CE by Frumentius, its rock-hewn churches at Lalibela labyrinths of faith carved by angels, per legend. The Ark of the Covenant. Folklore insists it rests in Axum's Chapel of the Tablet, guarded by black monks in white shrouds, a relic spirited south by Menelik, Solomon's son with Sheba. The Garima Gospels, radiocarbon dated to 390-660 CE in a Haik monastery vault, predate any Western New Testament codex. Their illuminations a riot of gold and lapis, faces unapologetically African. Africa isn't backdrop, isn't asterisk in the divine drama. Its origin, blueprint, witness. The forge, where God hammered humanity's form from red ochre clay, as San Bushmen still attest in Kalahari myths. Culturally, Eden's tree echoes the baobab, its fruit sustaining first foragers. Economically, Kush's gold-funded Solomonic temples. Politically, Axum's obelisks mirrored Gilgal's stones. Technologically, African hafted axes from 1.7 million years ago at Okonso-Gardala birthed toolmaking, rippling to Olduvai global legacy. Cradle migrations peopled Eurasia by 60,000 BCE, carrying Bantu innovations, yams, iron, to Madagascar. Regional impact. The Swahili coast's city-states traded ivory for Ming porcelain, linking Eden to empires. Controversies, young Earth creationists like Ken Ham, ironic namesake, map Eden to Iraq, ignoring geology. Afrocentrists like Yosef Ben-Jochannan in Black Man of the Nile, 1971, claim Adam's ruddy as dark red soil. A stretch but evocative sub-stories. The biography of Lucy's discoverer, Donald Johanson, whose 1974 find amid hyena scat revolutionized paleoanthropology, facing funding cuts for African bias. Or the Kung's Eden Tales, where first man emerges from a waterhole, paralleling Gihon's flow. Historiography. Herodotus again, calling Egypt the gift of the Nile, but noting its black priests. Modern DNA by David Reich's 2018 lab confirms 15% sub-Saharan input in ancient Egyptians, rising southward. So when doubters query black rolls in scripture, don't cite verses, point to Eden. It flowed through Kush, birthed kingdoms, carried promises unbleached by time. The promise was never pale, it was profound, primordial, pulsing with the continent's untamed heart. Conclusion: reclaiming the dawn, lessons from the buried flame. We've journeyed far together from the Ark's shadow to Eden's rivers, unearthing truths long interred under layers of myth and malice. We've met Ham not as cursed shade, but as solar patriarch, Kush as sovereign blaze, Mizraim as Nile's dark genius, Canaan as caution, not condemnation. We've cracked open Jubilee's vault, glimpsed Malcha's streets, felt the Gihon's current tug us home. And in this reclamation, what lessons rise like dawn over the Simeon Mountains? First, erasure is empire's oldest tool, not swords alone, but stories suppressed, faces faded from frescoes. We've seen how colonial pens rewrote Ham's heat as hellfire, how Victorian shovels bypassed Nubian gold for Greek potsherds, but truth endures, resilient as acacia roots in drought, proven by Diop's linguistics, Hawas's mummies, White's bones. The lesson? Question the canon, not with rage but rigor. Seek the excluded texts, the sidelined sources, for they hold the mosaic's missing tiles. Second, origins matter, not to divide, but to dignify. If Africa cradled Eden, forged the first cities, defended Jerusalem's walls, then every narrative of peripheral peoples crumbles. It invites global reflection, Europe's Renaissance, a revival of African learning via Moorish Spain, America's democracy, echoes of Aksum's councils, the future implication. In a world of rising nativisms, reclaiming black biblical centrality fosters unity, Revelation's multitude, not metaphor, but mandate for equity. Yet the deepest lesson is personal. Inheritance isn't inherited, it's excavated. Type it now, I reclaim my roots, for in that act, chains shatter. We've shaken the curse's ghost, restored Kush's crown, repainted Egypt's queens. But the work endures. Teach these tales to children, not in whispers, but roars. Challenge pulpits with psalms. Of Ham, walk the Sudanese sands where Tahaka trod, feeling history's pulse. What if, in remembering, we rewrite not just past, but possible? Africa first, not in arrogance, but awe, the blueprint for all. And as the sun dips over the Ethiopian plateau, casting long shadows from obelisks to oaks, know this: the flame Ham kindled burns still. In your veins, in these words, in the unyielding arc of justice. The world tried to make her last, but she was always first. And in that truth we all find home. Thank you for walking this path. The journey continues in your hands now.